I'm Mansa Musa, former political prisoner. In December the 5th of 2019, I was released from the Maryland prison system after serving 48 years and some change, almost 50 years in prison. And since I've been out, I've been active in doing a lot of things around the reentry of former political prisoners and prisoners in general. Right now, I'm currently involved with a group called Voices for a Second Chance that deals with providing critical services for men and women that are returning to society. I'm very active, as I've always been a social activist. I claim the political prisoner status because I became politicized while I was incarcerated. Was a member of a former Black Panther coalition or group in the Maryland Penitentiary. That's basically who I am. I'm 70 years old, and I'm a vibrant individual. I love our struggle. I love all things that's relative to resistance. That's who I am.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to another special bonus episode of Working People, a podcast about the lives, jobs, dreams, and struggles of the working class today. Brought to you in partnership with In These Times magazine and the Real News Network, produced by Jules Taylor, and made possible by beautiful Patreon subscribers like you. So as y'all heard, we got a really special episode today that I'm super excited about. We got my man Mansa Musa on the line today. And, if you guys have been following all the cool shit that we've been doing over at the Real News Network, then you already know about Mansa. As you heard in Mansa's introduction, Mansa was a political prisoner here in the United States, serving almost a half century locked up. And, he got to know our beloved comrade and co-worker, Eddie Conway, while he was on the inside. And now, along with the great and essential political advocacy work that Mansa does, the movement work that he does, he is also the co-host of our Real News show, Rattling the Bars, which, Eddie started here at the Real News and, really focuses on the victims and violence of the prison industrial complex. It's a really, really special show, really a vital show. And I would highly encourage anyone who listens to our show to check out Rattling the Bars. Like you should. It comes out every Monday. It's really great. We just published a killer episode that Mansa recorded about prison food and how fucking terrible it is and how evil it is that our system, our prison industrial complex, relies on rancid and unhealthy food that keeps incarcerated people just malnourished and causes health and psychological health impacts that linger long after people are released. So it's a really awful problem, and I thought Mansa's interview on that subject was really eye-opening. So I would highly encourage folks to check that out. We'll link to it in the show notes. Check out Rattling the Bars. Keep an eye out every Monday for new episodes. But like I said, I get the honor of working with Eddie, with Mansa. I know that listeners of the show have been asking about Eddie. Eddie is recovering. He's still in the hospital. He's got a long road ahead, but we know that Eddie is a warrior till the end, and we're sending him and his family and his loved ones nothing but love and solidarity. And we'll give you guys updates when we got them. But right now, we're really just sending all our love to Eddie and the family, and respecting their wishes for privacy during this tough time. And so, it's been really great to work with Mansa at the Real News. He's really kind of stepping up and taking the reins of the show while Eddie's recovering. And, I just figured, yeah, man, there's so much in what you do and the life that you've lived and the kind of struggles that you're involved in that really overlap with a lot of the stuff that we talk about here on this podcast. And so I'm super excited to talk to you about that. But I guess before we get there, Why don't we like kind of, on this show, we interview workers about their lives, like where they come from, how they came to be the people they are, and the jobs that they do and all that good stuff. So why don't we like do a short version of that and just kind of get to know a little more about you for the podcast listeners. So can you say a little more, I guess, about your backstory? Because were you born in DC or Maryland?
Yeah, I'm a native Washingtonian. I was born and raised in the southeast section of Washington, D.C. In 1952. I had 10 people who was involved in my family, 8 brothers, 8 siblings. My mother and father were working class. My father worked. My mother just stayed home and raised us. Grew up in the projects of Washington, D.C., like most people during that era, and most poor people during that era. We lived in subhuman conditions, but we didn't recognize them as such. I grew up in the era prior to the Civil Rights Movement, or the enactment of what they call the Civil Rights Bill. So I grew up in that period of civil disobedience and civil contempt on the part of poor people. Went to school, dropped out in the 10th grade, wind up becoming a petty criminal, heroin addict. That ultimately led me into prison. That's when I came into prison, I became politicized. Ran into Eddie Conway and former political prisoners or political prisoners at that time, and became politicized. In terms of my overall background, I'm an accomplished artist. I can draw. This is something that I love doing. I like to write. But overall, I'm a social activist, so I love organizing. I love organizing opposition to any oppressive conditions that we find ourselves in. And this is a good fit for me. The Real News and Rattling the Bars.
Yeah, and I would really encourage folks, again to both plug the show, but also because I think you guys would really like it. Eddie and Mansa actually did a great episode together a couple months ago where they kind of went in more depth, about Mansa's story, and I would highly encourage folks to check that out. We'll link to it in the show notes, so I won't make you kind of run through all of that again here, Mansa. But I was wondering if you could say a little more, right, about what DC was like back then, right? Because I was like, I guess for my generation, especially like I grew up in Southern California, and so I didn't know shit about the East Coast for most of my young life. And I remember just kind of hearing these stories about what DC like used to be and how kind of like New York, right? Is segregated. There's a lot of
That's right.
blight. So yeah, I guess could you say a little more about that environment that you grew up in?
And this being a show that deals with working class people and working class struggles, and this would be a good example of when in DC during that period you had a lot of social degradation, a lot of poor, a lot of people's on welfare, but for the most part, people work. The parents of people work. They even worked in digging ditches, the infrastructure, building up the infrastructure, roads, garbage men, trash men. Or in my father's case, my father was a highly educated individual. He programmed he did mainframe programming for the Navy Yard, and on the weekends he would take me there. He wrote a lot of programs for the Navy Yard, and ultimately he ultimately wrote the programs for the district government Department of Public Works. But in regards to because he was black and because he was poor, he never got the recognition. I always tell people that had we been white, and I'm not saying this is derogatory mean. I'm saying this as relate to the social strata. Had we been white, we would be my family would have been the Bill Gates prior to Bill Gates, because my father was just that brilliant. But because of his race, he was never given that opportunity, nor was anybody during that period. And during that period, the district government didn't have statehood, didn't have home rule, and they don't have statehood because they didn't have home rule. They was basically a colony, if for lack of a better word, of the federal government. And the federal government selected who would serve as the point person for administering the resources that the federal government gave to the district government. So during that period, you ain't have a lot of, you ain't have no job for children, no job for teenagers. You had very few jobs for anyone at that point, and the main jobs that existed was jobs in the terms of building up the infrastructure, sanitation, and infrastructure building. Any white collar job was very rare. And in terms of like you say, discrimination, Washington was very segregated. In certain parts of Washington, you could not go. And I lived in the southeast section of Washington, and I very rarely ventured out of it during my entire teenage years that I ventured out of it. And when I finally did venture out of it, when Marion Barry became the mayor and the Civil Rights Bill was passed, and he created a summer job program. So you had like a shift in the thinking process, because you had a small infusion of monies given to the poor and oppressed community. But overall, Washington was just like any other Southern town. Only difference was the repression and the racism wasn't as blatant as it was in, say, Alabama or Mississippi, or like Nina Simone say, Mississippi, goddamn. Or you could say Washington, D.C., goddamn, for the same reason, albeit you just didn't see it in the form of the raw repression that you've seen in the South.
Right. I mean, that's kind of the big thing that you learn the older that you get, right? It's like, man, it's not as like in your face in the South, but it's still very much there, right? It's just kind of taking a lot of forms. Like, I think, even growing up, I kind of understood that, because like, I grew up in Orange County, which a lot of people who aren't from California don't realize that, like, Orange County is a very racially and class like diverse place. Around Anaheim and Orange, you have tons of different Latino populations, working class populations. You have a big Vietnamese population because a lot of refugees were moved there after the war. You got a lot of kind of South Korean and Chinese folks living in parts of Orange County. So it's a much different than the bullshit that you see on the shows, right, where it just looks like a haven for rich white people, right? I mean, but at the same time, the obvious fact is that, like, Orange County in its like modern iteration, like, came to be what it was because of like that racial segregation between LA and Orange County, right? It's like,
Right.
it was the suburbs that people ran to, just like in Detroit, just like all over the country, right? The white flight thing was very real. And so I grew up even just knowing, right, that there was like a portal that you kind of pass through between LA and Orange County, but we had family on both sides of that. So that was always something that I was at least aware of. But definitely wasn't kind of as intense as what you're talking about, where you like basically just landlocked into one part of the city for a part of your life.
Yes, apartheid. And when you think of apartheid, this is what you see in DC for all intents and purposes. It was apartheid. People stayed in their neighborhoods. They didn't venture out to areas that was not like them. Institutional racism existed, in the form of, you had a vibrant welfare system. So the majority of, I remember this is kind of funny. They used to give out the welfare packages at the rental office, and the rental office at the end of the street, and we lived in the middle of the street. And so my mother would have me when she see the last person standing in line, she would have me stand in the line, and we walk all the way up, and we go up there. When we get up there, the people knew who we were. The people in the rental office, they would say, "Okay, oh, you Dolores Hopkins child, right?" And then somebody would even run back and say, "Mom, the stuff up there," and all of us would bring it back. But all the kids in the neighborhood, this is what we did. And you had a vibrant black market. You had the number runners. which is now the lottery. You had all kind of things that was going on. There was the subculture that existed, but it was the direct result of the oppression that was being inflicted on poor people during that time. Institutional racism was vibrant in D.C. And make no mistake about it. You go down to the we see a lot of the landmarks now. We used to go down to the monument as kids and just go down there and run up the steps and see, before we could fall out. And a lot of times when we go down there, they were like, "Nah, y'all can't come in here." Not because it wasn't open, it wasn't free to everybody, but because we look like a bunch of ragtime kids. We ain't have the nice clean clothes that the tourists had. We know we was dirty and we look menacing. So in their mind, we was up to something other than wanting to go down there and have some fun.
Man, and that shit just that's the real. I mean, I guess won't be news to anyone listening to this, but I think it's so important to think about how all those little types of interactions, right? All the little ways that society tells you you're not welcome, right? How that seeps into your brain and you carry it with you for years, if not the rest of your life. It just reminds me of I remember reading this in the book that Eddie and Paul Coates did, right? So it's called The Brother You Choose, by Susie Day, and it's a beautiful little book of conversations between Paul Coates, who's Ta-Nehisi Coates' dad, and Eddie, where they talk about their friendship from before Eddie was incarcerated, during, and after. But I think it was in the first or second chapter where Eddie talks about this, and he says I didn't even necessarily know that I had a kind of racial hatred. I just knew from being kind of treated as different and not having what the white kids had, that I had this sort of anger, this sort of aimless kind of anger build up inside of me that, you just want to take something from the white kids at your school, and you didn't necessarily know why. Right. And so I guess I was just kind of wondering if that kind of started to build up, in you and the folks that you were hanging out around, in your early years, or if you kind of shrugged that off and were just this is just the way the world is.
But see, and I can understand that perspective. Remind you, I grew up in the project. If you ain't see a white folk, you ain't see nobody white walk through your neighborhood. And we had people poor white people that lived in our neighborhood, but we didn't identify them as white. We identified them as poor people like we were. And their mannerisms was the same as ours. But to see somebody outside of your neighborhood that was white, never. So we moved to Merle, Prince George's County, in 1967. This was the first time I seen as many white people as I ever seen in my life. And now it's a paradigm shift in my head, because I'm seeing them and I'm not really understanding my discomfort towards them, more so than because they not the ones I'm going to school with are not menacing, and the ones that's in my neighborhood, just of my age, they're not menacing, but their parents are, and so you could see that disconnect. But when I went to high school, I remember that's why I dropped out, because the teachers were so blatantly racist that they always singled out Black students to try to belittle them in terms of assignments or class work or things of this nature. And I remember distinctly where we was doing spelling exam, and this white girl behind me, she was feeding me the answers, and the teacher seen her give me the answer, and didn't say nothing to her, would try to put me on the spot by embarrassing me. I walked out the class. And when I walked out the class, when I got home, I told my mother I'm not going back to that school no more. Because I already knew that if I go back to that school, that I'm going to it's going to be problematic. So ultimately, I wind up going to Job Corps. But I can understand that perspective because when in my neighborhood, they had back during the '60s, they had the draft, and the draft was like the lottery for those your audience that don't know. And they had these balls come up, and A1s or whatever and that would everybody would know who was. Everybody graduated out of high school that year. My brother, his whole entire class, our whole neighborhood was drafted.
Wow.
When you looked up like the next 2 months or the next 3 months, all the elders or all the ones, the generation were paved the way for us to be able to navigate a lot of things. They was gone. Either they was going to prison or they was going to the service. So that part of the passage or understanding how to navigate that social conditions was void. When we moved out of Maryland, you don't have that. And you're looking at the heels of Malcolm got killed and then King got killed. And then now you looking at a situation where when King get killed, we're in Maryland and you don't have one black police on Prince George's County Police Force. But basically, when you look at Soweto, Shopfield, and all them places, how the South African government was, and when the towns shit was locked down, that's how DC was locked down when King got killed. And they still tore up DC. But in Maryland, you better not came out your house.
Man, I mean, like, and it's, Jesus, I'm here in Baltimore. I can hear the sirens going on outside my window, like basically all the time. Like I can hear them now. And, we still had those goddamn lockdowns.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think we had like a whole neighborhood lockdown like 3 years ago or 4 years ago, right? When police were doing like a quote unquote manhunt. And instead of doing actual police work, they just fucking put an entire black poor neighborhood on lockdown. It was just it's insane. And I wanted to pick up on that, right? Because I think you talked about this a little bit in the interview that you and Eddie did for Rattling the Bars, but I wanted to ask like how your political consciousness developed, right? Because you're growing up around this time, that's just it's just hearing it from you. I'm still trying to kind of imagine where my head would have been, right? Where you see these great figures in the civil rights movement just be taken down, and then you see the response of the white establishment. And I like, did that start to kind of push your brain in that sort of political direction at that time, or did that come later when you were already incarcerated?
I kind of think that the seeds was there, but when you in an environment and social conditions are such that it's survival of the fittest, and you're not you're hungry, you're malnourished, you don't have a lot, and that becomes the focus of most people, most poor people. This is why you find in most poor people in most poor neighborhoods, you find the high level of crime, criminal activity, because it be the lack of quality education, lack of job, lack of health care, the lack of. And so whatever creates something that gives you even the illusion of wealth, you gravitate towards at the demise of anybody. And I think I was in there. And so I became political. Once I got locked up, I knew that my situation was such that I wasn't, chance of me getting out of prison alive was slim enough. One, I had committed an armed robbery murder, and the person that was the victim of the crime was a off-duty policeman, white off-duty policeman in Prince George's County. So by the virtue of whatever power there exists, I'm alive because I wasn't supposed to be alive. The officers that arrested me at some point told me that he should have blew my brains out while I was still on the street. But the fact that I am alive, and when I got incarcerated, I became I started like doing some introspection. And mind you, during that time, I got locked up in 72. George Jackson had just got killed, Attica, on the heels of the Attica Rebellion. And prisons throughout the United States had been rebelling against oppressive and inhumane conditions. So the environment I found myself in was right for raising the consciousness of people. And that's when I started becoming political. I started reading a lot of Black classics, Richard Wright, No More Lies by Dick Gregory,
Oh
Malcolm
wait,
X.
which Richard Wright?
I read Native Son, Richard Wright's Native Son.
Oh, I fucking love that book.
Yeah,
It's such a good book.
and yeah, it is. And Digger, bigger. Yeah, they really gave bigger a bigger share. But yeah, and things like that. Then ultimately, I evolved in the prison letters of George Jackson, Blood in My Eyes, a lot of Marxism, Leninism, Mayo. I started reading these things prior to going into the penitentiary. And so I already knew what I wanted to do once I got in the penitentiary. I already knew that my intent was to find somebody that was political, had a revolutionary ideology, a social position. And I ran into one of our comrades, a brother named Thomas Gaither. And but during that time, Eddie and them we had a collective called the Maryland Penn Intercommunal Survival Collective. They had a newsletter they was putting out, and they was giving out to the receiving units in the penitentiary. And the guy walked by, and I seen it, asked him for one. He gave it to me. And when I eventually got in the general population, I linked up with them, and started a long journey towards my evolution and becoming the political prisoner that I was and the political activist that I am.
Well, I mean, like, and I'm gonna preface this with saying that, like, even after getting to work with Eddie and now you, right, and getting to hear through the people that y'all interview, and doing a lot of reading myself and talking to other folks. I mean, I've worked with a lot of people who've been incarcerated before. Like, I've had people I grew up with who got locked up. Like, but I fundamentally don't know that world, right? And so there's a lot of it is like me trying to kind of understand what it would be like to like live on the moon, basically. And so, like, I guess I'm just curious, like, how you guys kept I guess, could you talk a bit more about that, like that sense of keeping the revolution alive, even though you were in like the worst place imaginable? Like, I know that y'all did organizing there. You tried to build up relationships between activists like outside of the prison and folks inside the prison, and doing reading clubs and stuff like that. I guess, could you just, for folks who are listening who genuinely have no idea what that's like, could you say a little more about that political activity that y'all were doing at that time?
Yeah, and you know what? This is the for your listeners, when we talk about Eddie, this is the Eddie Conway that a lot of people they come around know. Eddie, when I came into the penitentiary, Eddie, we had a collective and there was former Black Panthers and just people that wanted to become more conscious. So we had a lot of political education camp, but Eddie took interest in me, and we would go into the bleachers and with the red book, Mayo's red book, and he would be giving me we be having political education class, and the purpose of that was to get me to understand how to analyze, how to be analytical, and understand social conditions, and understand the subjective and objectivity of social conditions, to be able to understand them to the point where I'll be able to effect change in them. So if I don't have this thinking process, then I'm not going to survive, because the prison environment going to consume you if you can't think, because it's just inevitable that the prison environment is built for that reason, to tear you down and destroy you. mentally, physically, psychologically, every aspect of your being destroyed. George Jackson say, if I leave here alive, I leave nothing behind. Saying that he would, that at no term, under no circumstance in term would he be a broken individual. So when we look at how we survived that, we survived it by understanding that we were fighting for a higher ideal. That we weren't fighting the prison conditions. We were fighting for the liberation of poor and oppressed people. That we was playing a role in that, and our role in that was to educate the environment that we was in to understand that they're more than. I think Comrade George said that in when he came in, that their goal was to change the black criminal mentality into a revolutionary mentality, and educating them, raise their conscience to understand that no, you're not a criminal, you're a victim, and you're a victim because the system has always been stacked against you. You're not gonna get justice because you don't have money to buy justice. You're gonna get exactly what you got coming. And your social conditions that you live in produce that. So we was able to take that and organize people to understand like we had a right to adequate medical treatment, and therefore we wasn't getting adequate medical treatment. We would either strike or we would boycott or we would file litigation. We had a right to healthy food, and if we didn't get healthy food, we would do the same thing. We had a mantra, and we had a right to be treated like human beings. And if you brutalize us, then we was going to respond by defending ourselves. So in a lot of cases, a lot of us winded up on lockup and was brutalized because the police assaulted us, and we in turn defended ourselves. And this went on and on and on. But in terms of our overall goal was to humanize the individual that was in prison, to show that the inhuman conditions that we were subjected to did not define us, that we defined ourselves. And we reached out to society. We organized programs to bring people in from the community to show them that we are human and that they had a vested interest in supporting us. We organized unions, industry, to say that we had a right to be treated fair. We had the same rights as anybody else that's working. We're working in the industry that's getting a multi-million-dollar industry that's paying us slave wages. We had a right to ask for a minimum wage, and we fought for those things. And we fought to change the narrative and the conditions that we was under. And to a large extent, we did change some things. We brought college programs in. A lot of men graduated from college. We brought a better education system in. A lot of men got their GEDs and was able to read and write. We was able to get a better medical system to come in, and a lot of people got better medical treatment. But overall, we're dealing with a monster. The prison industrial complex is the new plantation, and the prisoners are the new chattel. So the pendulum swings back and forth. The pendulum swinging back to this massive prison industrial complex and all the evils that's coming out of it that we fought against. But overall, it was the fact that we raised our consciousness and became political in terms of understanding conditions and analyzing conditions with the understanding of how to change them, how to create the narrative where people understand that, no, you have a right to be treated a certain way, and that it's your obligation to fight for your rights.
Oh yeah. And I mean, I want to, like I said up top, I want us to kind of round this conversation, which is great. I want to round this out by sort of talking about why it's so important for the labor movement, as we understand it, right, to really link arms with and build common cause with the movement for decarceration, for abolition, right? The movement, as we say, if you're going to fight for the dignity and sanctity of human life, it's got to be all or nothing, right? You can't get caught in this game of determining who is and isn't a qualified human being that we should care about, right? Because then, the values that you're trying to fight for will never be universal. They can never, really unite us in the way that we need to be united against this kind of monstrous system. So I want to make sure that that's where we end up. But I guess like by way of getting us there, I wanted to kind of pick up on something that you said, right, about the exploitation that goes on in prisons, and how prisoners are essentially, the new chattel slaves. I mean, like, and for anyone listening, we're not being hyperbolic about that. Like, that's just what is happening, right? That is why in this like country, what is it, the 13th Amendment? Like,
Amendment.
you can the one case in which slavery is still legal in this country is as a punishment for a crime, and prisons do that. Like, that's how you have states where people, incarcerated people, are pushed into forced labor and get maybe 6 cents, like an hour, if that. Like, and there were plenty of places where that was happening for free, and you get a lot of like blood sucking corporations that use this kind of slave labor. And again, even thinking about how this ties in the rest of the labor movement, how do you think it like everyone's always talking about, oh, immigrants are taking our jobs, or low wage non-union workers are undercutting us. It's like, motherfucker, everyone's getting undercut by prisons using literal slave labor, and the only ones who are making out like bandits are the actual bandits, right? Are the CEOs and companies. The incarcerated people are getting fucked. You're getting fucked. Like, we need to see the bigger picture here. But I guess I just wanted to ask a little bit about that, right? Because a lot of the time on this show, we focus on people's working lives, what they do day in, day out, the kind of work that they do, the different issues that they have to deal with from managers, from customers, and all that kind of stuff. So I was wondering if you could like just tell listeners a little bit more about like the labor of being incarcerated. Like how does that sort of fit into an incarcerated person's life? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes good sense. And we recognize that capitalism is the evil in this narrative. When you're talking about working people and unions, we recognize that capitalism, that greedy bloodsuckers, and everything about profit. So when you look at the prison industrial complex, and you look at on both sides of the fence, one, you have industries that come in and exploit prison labor. You had that same industry that's making massive amount of money at the expense of prisoners, making no contribution to the livelihood of the prisoners or the quality of the environment that the people that's working there have to go deal with. So you find yourself as a working person, and you're a prison guard. You come in there and and your whole purpose is you have a job. But at the same token, you're no different than the person you stand over, because at any given time, you sign a contract saying that if an event, a disturbance take place, and you're taking a hostage, that your life is expendable. So your relationship with your boss at that point in time is one of trying to get out, trying to do your 8 and get out. In the prison population and the labor in relation to the labor movement, we always try to get more money out of the industry that we work for. Like in Maryland, they got Maryland Correction Enterprise, and Maryland Correction Enterprise is the leading industry in the state of Maryland. They got absolute right to all contracts come out of state facilities or state institutions. They make the furniture for the state house. They make the bunk beds and the beds and the cabins for the prison. They put the chemicals in the bags that used for like cleaning. Everything coming out, and they got absolute control over that, and don't have the people that's working don't have no right to say the conditions that they working under is inhumane or unsafe. They have to go there, and if you're gonna go there and work, or you're gonna get an infraction. This is the same process in the prison, in the federal system. Unicorn is the same way. Absolute control. Federal government say they get absolute right to all federal contracts. So when you look at the relationship between the labor movement and prison, any working class person want to have two things when they go to work: a safe and healthy environment and adequate pay. A safe and healthy environment and adequate pay. If they can work in a safe and healthy environment, and that means without the stress of somebody standing over top of them, telling them that they got a deadline to make. If they don't make the deadline, putting them under a lot of stress and strain, and they got adequate pay for their work, then they'll be comfortable working in that environment. But in this country right now, this is not the case. The labor movement is seriously under attack, and when we see what at one time as massive labor movement, now the identity is obscured by a lot of back channel dealing, about a lot of like underhand treatment of, well, why unionize when we're gonna give you what you would get if you was a union, and therefore you won't have to become a body that say you want this. Just come an individual and say you want this, and you individually you can get this, and by virtue of that, you done create a mentality where, yeah, why would I want to organize a union? Why would I want to be organized and ask for better health care, more wages, a retirement package, when the person tell me I can come to them and ask them for it, and they'll give it to me, but they're not going to give it to the next person down or the next person down. And when they get tired of me, they can fire me, and I don't have no redress. So yeah, the labor movement in prison is something that really need to be looked at. And I'm going to close on this note right here, Max. Everybody that's a working class in the society, I guarantee you, have a family member that's incarcerated, or they know somebody that's incarcerated. That right there should tell you enough about this process and the relationship.
Yeah, no, I think that's really powerfully put, man. And just to kind of pick up on that, and then I don't want to keep you too long, so I promise I'll let you go after this. But I think that is a really important point that I really want to drive home for people and hear a few more of your thoughts on, right? Because I even think back to where we started, right? You were talking about growing up in DC. You talked about the draft, right? And that really, really struck me, right? Because I think, we could talk all day, right, about how the military industrial complex has changed over, the past half century, right? Because I think it was often very, very true, right, that the military and military recruitment and the draft, I mean, like you can look at it, like rich kids could buy their way out of it. White kids could, they could go to school instead. So it became like this vacuum for, poor and working class people, black people, brown people, indigenous people, white people, right? I mean, like that was well understood to kind of be one of the great evils at the center of the American kind of military, is that it fed off of and still in a lot of ways feeds off of that, right? So a lot of people go into the military because they can't pay for college, right? And so that's the reason that they do it, which is just a horrifying sentence to say, but we've all just kind of accepted that as normal now. But at the same time, right, the draft did go away. And the military, I think, recognized that it was going to kind of angle itself towards more of those middle class people who could like be drone operators and shit like that. But it got me thinking when you brought up the draft, right, and how you saw so many people from your high school just get sucked into that black hole of Vietnam, which we never should have happened in the first fucking place. But it got me thinking about, just that the larger dimension of class that's kind of all around this conversation, from you growing up, from the draft in high school, to the way you got treated at school, and then even in prison, right? Because again, I think it's so obvious at times that we almost lose sight of it, but like Mansa was just saying, right? You open the hood or open the roof of any prison, you're going to find a shit ton of people from poor and working class communities, and you're going to find a whole lot of Black people and people of color, right? I mean, like, that's not a coincidence, right? It's not a coincidence that the marginalized and underserved and under-resourced and heavily policed parts of society are the ones who end up in, like, populating the prisons. And then, they become this slave labor force, exploited to all hell. Their, bodies and brains and souls just broken down in this brutal fucking system over years. Some don't make it out alive, right? It's just such a brutal, like, system that we live with and live next to every single day. But I think where Mansa and I are getting with this is that it's not separate from the larger economic monster that we spend so much time talking about on this show, right? And the that same monster that exploits our labor and sucks up all of the value that we generate at work, and doesn't, like, distribute that equally. It doesn't distribute that in a way that allows more working people to, buy a house and send their kid to college and live comfortably and retire. No, it's the opposite. It pushes us in the opposite direction. It pushes us downward to the point that now we're like, people are working like 2 or 3 gig jobs, or part-time jobs, just to, and cost of living keeps going up. The fucking minimum wage hasn't been raised in the longest period ever, right? You guys see where we're going with this, right? It's this downward funnel that this economy pushes working people into. And at the bottom of that funnel is fucking prison. Right. Yep. And so this is all connected. And Mansa, I guess I just wanted to kind of toss it to you. Do you think, like, am I getting that right? Is this kind of like how y'all were connecting it? And I guess what would your thoughts be for folks listening about why it's so important for the labor movement to understand itself in solidarity with and part of the movement to end the prison industrial complex?
Yeah, because right now, labor, as we see it right now, we don't see a vibrant labor movement in terms of, like, really advocating for the quality of the workers, because the industry, capitalism, they didn't redefine how they approach people. That's why you have Walmart don't want people to unionize. You have Starbucks, some is, some not. But when you find yourself, the labor movement needed to understand that you're just one step away from finding yourself locked up. If you find yourself protesting about your working conditions and management feels some kind of way about it, they can lock you up. Remember, Ronald Reagan busted the air traffic controllers. He was the first union buster that we know of. And this is a problem. So at the end of this process, you have capitalism at the beginning, you have imperialism in there, and then you have the prison industrial complex is where everybody's going to end up at. They have any type of opposition to what goes on there. So it's important that we recognize that we're more alike than we're different. Everybody want a quality life. Everybody should have a right to a quality. Everybody should have a right to a wage, a livable wage. But these greedy bloodsuckers don't want to see that. And when you step out and ask for these things and demand these things, then you become a threat. And remember, it was Dr. King got killed because he was down there on behalf of labor. He got killed because he was advocating for to take the monies that was being put in the war to be given to people to get jobs and better living conditions and better wages. So to say that, to look at us as being anything other than connected, we are connected. And very much so in a lot of ways, we're more alike than we're different. And we need to recognize that, and we need to, like, find a commonality in this and work together to decarcerate in prison, the prison industrial complex, organize for better wages for working class people, better working conditions for working class people, and working class people have a right. This is your God-given right, your constitutional right to unionize.